I'm going to rush through as fast as I can an overview of history. John F. Kennedy said, history, after all, is the memory of a nation. Well, guess what? America's lost its memory. But it's not been by accident, it's intentional. There's actually a communist tactic called deconstruction, where you separate someone from what they believe in the past, get them into a neutral where they don't know what's going on, and then you can brainwash them into a future. And so if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I would do is say negative things about the toothpaste you're currently using. You're using that old stuff, it'll dry out your gums and eat the enamel off your teeth. And ooh, you're repulsed by it, so now I got you into this neutral where I can say, hey, you're open-minded, you need to look at all the different toothpaste out there nowadays, and then I can give you my pitch for this tartar control breath freshener stuff. And so when they apply this culturally, and they say to the kids in school, your founding fathers were slave owners, took land from Indians, and they were chauvinists, and the kids are, repulsed by them. Then you get them into this neutral where they're sort of open-minded. What are all the beliefs that are out there nowadays? And then you can give them your pitch for communism or socialism or LGBT. We see this happen in Europe. Europe went from a Judeo-Christian past into a secular, free-sex, gay neutral, and now Europe is going into an Islamic future. Right? Europe used to all be Catholic and a Protestant Reformation with Jewish neighborhoods. And then Europe went into the neutral with the French Revolution and Robespierre and Napoleon spreading all this French secularism. And now Europe is facing an Islamic future. Now, America needs its memory back, and we need to know how rare we are in world history. So if we're going to look at world history. Do you know what the most common form of government in all of world history is? Well, there's approximately 6,000 years of recorded human history. Writing was invented around 3300 BC, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley, right? Take a stick, poke it in clay. This is the beginning of writing. Egyptian hieroglyphics around 3000 BC and Chinese pictograms around 2600 BC. And so if you have a quote from James Wilson, he signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they and their posterity should live. He thought something really unique happened in this 6,000 years. And Daniel Webster said, miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. He thought something really unique happened in America. Well, 6,000 years is only 60 people living 100 years each back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it, maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you are all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history, right? We got 4,000 BC and 2080 to 6,000 years. 6,000 years is also the time that there's been a quest to rule the world. So we go back to the very first concentrated power was Nimrod in the Tower of Babel. And God comes down and confuses the languages and the people scatter. So now we're beginning to see concentrated power defiantly against God and God scattering. And so power wants to concentrate into the hands of one person. We call this one person by different names. Sargon of Akkadian and Alexander the Great and Cyrus of Persia and Montezuma and Chandragupta in India and Attila the Hun and Genghis Khan and Justinian and King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. But the most common form of government is king. Now, communism is kings. Every communist country has a dictator, right? Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong. And the Communist Party members are the new royalty. And then the people are the peasants. And people say, well, I thought communism is everybody owns everything equally. Let's think a little deeper. Who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever ultimately dictates those things is the dictator. So communism is just dictatorship with a remake. And so the most common form of government is a king. It's a dictator. And power wants to concentrate. It's like the pull of a magnet, like the law of gravity. It's like a pecking order. And remember the movie The Lord of the Rings? There's a scene where Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And I think it's in the human DNA. It goes back to the fall in the garden and Cain killing Abel and one king taking a kingdom from another king. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them will take the rattle from the others. Put some kids on a playground, one of them is the bully hawking the ball. Put some natives in the woods, one of them is the Indian chief, and put them in an inner city, one of them is the gang leader. And all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader, right? I mean, here's Louis XIV, the Sun King. He said, I am the state. Talk about an ego there. And so it's this patronage system where if you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. It just happens. Imagine if you got to be the king and you were going to be really fair. And then you have a sister with a teenage son that drinks and drives and hits somebody with the car, and now this kid's facing life imprisonment, and your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let little Johnny get locked away the rest of his life. It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah. What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if you're family or close friends with the king, you get a little special treatment. And if you're not family or friends, you don't get it. And if you're an enemy, the king's going to be tempted to shut you up. And so when power concentrates, it will be corrupt. There will be favoritism. It took centuries before America was given the chance to break away from a king. And we're going to jump through very quickly. So 610 AD, Muhammad starts his faith. And he is a religious leader. You think, how does this figure into America? Follow me, we'll get there. Muhammad is a religious leader for 12 years in the pagan city of Mecca. And he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. And Muhammad gets confrontational. And the people of Mecca decide to chase Muhammad out of town. And he flees north 210 miles to Medina. And so Muhammad is, in a sense, the first Muslim refugee. He was chased out of Mecca, no place to live. He's a Muslim refugee. And so the Medina is controlled by Jews, 3 Jewish tribes, and they were nice. They let Muhammad into town as a Muslim immigrant. And so Muhammad goes into the minority neighborhoods in Medina and begins to organize a following. We're familiar with the term of organizing in the community. And he gets a following. He goes back to the Jewish leaders and he pressures them to accommodate him politically. You know, don't offend us and change your laws. And so they make a treaty with Muhammad. And now Muhammad is a political leader in addition to being a religious leader. Then something happens. Muhammad's followers in Mecca, they get pushy, argumentative, and threatening. They get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. They're Muslim refugees. They have no place to go. They go to Medina. The Jews are nice. They let Muhammad's followers in as Muslim immigrants, and they gravitate to Muhammad's neighborhood. Muhammad allows his followers to rob the caravans headed to Mecca in retaliation for the Meccans chasing him out of town. So where Jesus said, if they take your coat, give them your shirt, his attitude was, if they take your house, you retaliate, take their caravan. He got a whole chapter of the Quran from his Allah on how to distribute booty from robbing caravans. It's Surah 8, chapter 8. He gets a fifth of the booty. And so they're robbing the caravans, and the Meccans send 1,000 soldiers to protect their caravan, and Muhammad with 300 warriors defeats 1,000 at the Battle of Badra in 624 AD. This amazing victory convinces Muhammad to be a military leader. So he fights in 66 battles in the next 8 years before he dies. He even used the catapult when he attacked the city called Al-Taif. And when they told Muhammad the catapult was hurling these rocks, killing innocent women and children, Muhammad's response was, they are among them. They got to be killed too. So suicide bombers and ISIS killers and San Bernardino killers say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad did when he used the catapults at Al-Taif. And since Muhammad is the perfect Muslim, the best Muslims that want to be better Muslims are wanting to be like him religiously, politically, and militarily. So there's freedom for all religions in America, but Islam is not just a religion because Muhammad was not just a religious leader. He was a political and a military leader. So a mosque is a religious building, a political building, and a military building. And our effort in the West to split the religious side of Islam away from the political military side is we're trying to split Muhammad. Who are we to split their prophet? And so we see that Muhammad gets offended at one of the Jewish tribes, and he confiscates their property, whips his followers into a frenzy, and they chase that tribe out of town. And then Muhammad gets offended at a second Jewish tribe, confiscates their property, chases them out of town, and then the third Jewish tribe, he battles in their neighborhood for 25 days, and then he brings them into the market and chops off their heads, 600 or 700 of them. And so within 5 years of Muhammad coming into this Jewish city of Medina, there's not a Jew left in the city of Medina. They were chased out, killed, or enslaved. And so there's within 5 years of Muhammad's death, every pre-existing culture in Arabia was wiped out. And we see this lightning expansion where Muslims conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. The name Christian was first used in Syria until Caliph Umar conquered it. Egypt had been Christian for 6 centuries, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, until Amir ibn al-As conquered it. And then there were 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa, and the Muslims conquered those. And when this happened, it was a heart attack to the Roman economy, right? Because they traded across the Mediterranean, and now the Muslims cut off the trade. It's sort of like today, if China held all their ships back, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty and our economy would grind to a halt. And then one of the things the Muslims held back was the ships of papyrus. These were reeds that grew along the Nile Delta that they dried out and used for paper. So suddenly there was a paper shortage in Europe. They wrote fewer books, and we call this the Dark Ages. So Islam's largely responsible for Europe entering the Dark Ages. And then in the year 711, 80,000 Muslims invade Spain, conquer it in 10 years because they're on horseback with scimitar swords, and the Europeans are still on foot. And then they come around so that was all the first Arab Spring, right? Went from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. It was a military campaign. And since this is Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, Muslims today that want to follow their example end up becoming more militant. And then the Turks convert to Islam, and they invade into what is today Turkey. Back then it was the Byzantine Empire. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were wiped out by the Muslim Turks, and the Greek Christians begged the Catholic West for help. The West sends help. It's called the what? The Crusades, 9 major crusades in 200 years. Richard the Lionheart led the 3rd crusade. St. Louis led the 7th and 8th crusades. When the crusades end, the Muslims pick up and reinvade Europe. So they have 14 centuries of crusades. The Europeans had 2 centuries of crusades. In the year 1300, they control all of Spain, North Africa, the Zanzibar coast of Madagascar, over to Indonesia, and northern Indian Mughal, Central Asia, and then into Eastern Europe. And then you have these Serbs and Bulgarians and Albanians and Wallachian, Moldovans, Hungarian, Polish. They're fighting off this Muslim gang so that the rest of Europe can develop its art, literature, and music. By the year 1450, the Muslims surround Constantinople. This is the big city that connects the East and the West. And when Constantinople falls to the Muslims in the year 1453, it ends the land trade routes to get to India and China. People forget Marco Polo went from Venice, Italy to China in the year 1271. He brings back spaghetti. Spaghetti noodles were invented in China. The Chinese invented paper currency from tree pulp rather than from papyrus reeds. What did they do with that paper? They made the first paper currency. Your paper currency in your wallet came from China during the Yuan dynasty. That's why they call it the yuan to this day. Chinese invented the wheelbarrow, the Pony Express, the compass. They had a thread from worms, silkworms. Chinese invented gunpowder. They invented plates made out of China, right? We have it on the table there because it came from China. So they were technologically superior to Europe. So the Europeans wanted to trade, and India had teas, dyes, and spices. And so this was trading until the Muslims conquered Central Asia, cut off the land routes. In what year? 1453, the year Constantinople fell. So once Constantinople fell to the Muslims, it cut off the land routes. The Europeans began to look for a sea route. And a guy named Columbus said, I've got an idea, sail west. He runs into some islands. He thinks he's in India, so he names the people the Indians. Think of it. We never would have called Native Americans Indians if it had not been for Islamic jihad. If it had not been for the Islamic State, the Caliphate, cutting off the land routes to India and China, giving Columbus the impetus to find a sea route. And as the Muslims were invading into Greece, the Greek scholars were picking up and fleeing to Florence, Italy, taking with them their Greek art, architecture, and literature. And so this flood of Greek stuff into Italy we call the Renaissance. So Islam's responsible for the Dark Ages when they conquer Egypt, hold back the ships of papyrus, and they're responsible for the Renaissance when they're invading Greece and the Greek scholars. But the Greek scholars also flee with their Greek New Testaments. And so now Western Europe is translating the Bible not just to Latin, but all the way back to Greek. And this interest in the original language and meaning laid the foundation for something we call the Reformation. So in 1517, Martin Luther starts the Reformation. In 1529, 100,000 Muslims surround Vienna, Austria, under Suleiman the Magnificent. And Martin Luther says, the Turk is the rod of the wrath of the Lord our God. If the Turk's God, the devil, is not beaten first, there is reason to fear the Turk will not be so easy to beat. The fight against the Turks must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives or we shall fight in vain. Our sins have earned God's wrath, so he justly gives us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. John Calvin wrote, I hear the sad condition of your Germany. The Turk again prepares to wage war with a larger force. Who will stand up to oppose his marching throughout the land at his mere will and pleasure? John Wesley later wrote, ever since the religion of Islam appeared in the world, espousers of it have been as wolves and tigers to all other nations, rending and tearing all that fell into their merciless paws. 2 centuries before the Reformation, Thomas Aquinas wrote, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure. Those who believed in him were brutal men, desert wanderers. Muhammad forced others to become his followers by the violence of his arms. And so Sultan Suleiman controlled this entire huge area, all in North Africa, Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and then into Persia and the Middle East, and then into Turkey, and then into Eastern Europe. His counterpart was the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Spain. We know him because he was 25 years old when he sat there at the hearing with Martin Luther. Remember, Martin Luther says, here I stand, so help me God. Well, now the years go by, and Charles V is faced with this growing dilemma. He thought Martin Luther was just a dispute amongst monks, right? And now it's turned into this big Reformation, but now he's got this Muslim. So in 1529, the Muslims are surrounding Vienna, and so he decides he's going to strike a deal with the Protestants. And these are the two most powerful kings in the world. Sort of like the Cold War with the U.S. and the USSR. Back then, it was the Muslim East and the Catholic West. And so Charles V has this double dilemma, Protestant Reformation, Muslim invasion. And so he strikes a deal called the Treaty of Augsburg of 1555. This is the first treaty to recognize Protestants. And there's a little Latin phrase that had huge repercussions that affected the founding of America. What's this phrase? Cuius regio, eius religio, which is whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. Let's just work together against these Muslims because they want to come in and kill us all. And so it worked. They stopped the Muslim invasion, but it started a domino effect in the next century, where different kings decided to believe slightly different things. Northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran, Switzerland Calvinist, Scotland Presbyterian, Holland Dutch Reformed, Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, England was Anglican, and of course Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, Poland remained Catholic. You see, prior to the Muslim invasion, it was all Catholic, but because the invasion was so serious is when Charles V lightened up and says, believe whatever you want. Well, they did, and it started this domino effect. So in Europe, it was what the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And it was one Christian denomination per country. And so there was this mass migration of people shifting all around Europe in the 1600s simply for conscience sake. Those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. And if you did not believe the way your king did, you were persecuted and you fled. Well, let's look at England. England had a king, Henry VIII. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the King of Spain. Remember how big and powerful Spain is? And Catherine has no son. After 18 years, Henry decides to divorce her. The Pope would not recognize the divorce because Charles V earlier had sent his army into Italy and imprisoned the Pope for 6 months. So this Pope doesn't want to get on the bad side of Spain, so he does not recognize Henry VIII's divorce of Catherine of Aragon. And so Henry VIII decides he's far enough away from Italy, he'll just make himself his own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself on as the head, and he goes on to have 6 wives. And their fates were divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. Well, his advisors suggested if he really wanted to break with Rome, he should stop using that old Latin Bible, get himself an English Bible. He spreads the English Bible around the country thinking this will solidify my break, but something unexpected happened. People began to read it and began to compare what's in this Bible to this king divorcing and beheading his wives, and so a group started that wanted to purify the Church of England called the Puritans. The king didn't think he needed any purifying, so he persecuted this group. He would actually send spies into the churches to listen to the pastor's sermons, and if the pastor departed from the Anglican liturgy, the pastor was arrested, sort of like the Houston mayor wanting to get all the sermons of the pastors, right? Well, there was another group in England that said it's beyond hope of trying to purify the Anglican church. We're simply going to separate ourselves. And they did. They met in barns and basements, and they eventually fled to Holland, and we call them who? The Pilgrims. So if you don't believe the way your king did, you're persecuted, you fled. These Pilgrims went to Holland. After 12 years, they came to America. And so they got blown off course. They were going to land in Virginia. I read through every charter of every colony. Almost all of them, it's the king deciding who's going to be in charge in his stead. Well, when the Pilgrims got blown off course, there was no king-appointed person on their boat because they were going to go to Jamestown. And so they said, well, we can't just get off the boat because it was bad weather and winter, and the captain says, you're going to stay in Massachusetts. They say, well, we can't be a law unto ourselves. And so they decide to write the Mayflower Compact. This is the first constitution written in the New World, and it's unique. This is the beginning. It says, in ye presence of God, we covenant ourselves together into a civil body politic to enact just and equal laws as shall be thought most meet, and unto which we promise all due submission. This was them granting themselves permission to start a government under God and agreeing to render all due submission to the laws they passed. This was revolutionary. It became a blueprint for the other New England colonies like Connecticut, the Constitution State, and it became a blueprint for the U.S. Constitution, which starts off how? We the people. This is us granting ourselves permission. And the word federal is Latin for covenant. We have a covenant form of government that goes back to the Pilgrims. And so, you go to the U.S. Capitol, and where Congressman McEwen served all those years, and in the big rotunda, you have paintings, and one of them is the Pilgrims in a boat with a big open Bible, and who's holding the Bible? Their pastor, John Robinson. So these Pilgrims learned from their pastor how to have this form of government where there's no king on top. And it was this New Testament model where if you got really tough decisions, you get the whole church together, you fast and pray and you vote. And so every colony in America was started by a different Christian denomination. I read through every charter. Virginia was an Anglican colony. Massachusetts was a Puritan colony. New York was a Dutch Reformed colony. Maryland originally was a Catholic colony until it got taken over by the Anglicans and so forth. New Jersey was a Swedish Lutheran colony, New Sweden, along with Delaware, until it got taken over by the Dutch, then taken over by the British. Rhode Island was a Baptist colony. Pennsylvania was a Quaker colony. William Penn's dad was the famous admiral that captured Jamaica from the Spanish, and William Penn's dad defeated the Dutch Navy, which meant the Dutch could no longer defend New Amsterdam, and so that's when New Amsterdam became New York. So William Penn's dad was a pretty important guy. William Penn was the going between the dad and the king, delivered messages, and then William Penn, the junior, is going to Oxford, and he sees this group on campus, and they're always getting in trouble. He listens, it's the Quakers. And he sort of likes them, and so he's hanging around them, and then the groups get raided, and they get arrested, and now William Penn Jr. is in jail. And the dad has to fish him out, and the dad's like, what are you doing hanging around that Quaker group? Don't you know the king's the head of the church, and I'm like friends with the king, and I don't want to get on the wrong side of him? And William Penn Jr. is like, no, and so he causes so much problem. The son is locked in the Tower of London for 8 months. And the dad finally fishes him out, and the son says, I don't need your money. And the dad says, look, I'm dying. Just promise me you won't violate your conscience. Anyway, so the king, Charles the II, decides that he is going to let William Penn, after the dad dies, get land in the New World. And it's called Pennsylvania. And Charles II, gives William Penn 45,000 square miles. It makes William Penn the largest private landowner in the world, right? The largest non-royalty landowner. And what does William Penn do with this land? He invites all the persecuted people from Europe, and he tries to do this holy experiment in Pennsylvania to see if Christians of different denominations can live together in the same geographic area. You see, the other colonies had the idea of Europe. If you don't like our denomination, fine, start your own colony. This was them saying, oh, let's see if we can live together. And anyway, so in Pennsylvania, the Continental Congress met, the Declaration was written, the Constitution was written. Georgia was a plain Protestant colony. Connecticut and New Hampshire were Congregationalist colonies. And the Carolinas were all together. And it was proprietary colonies. So the whole thing was given to 7 property owners called the 7 Lord Proprietors. And they wanted to hurry up and populate the Carolinas because they wanted to get some commerce going so they could make a little money. They didn't want the king taking away their charter. And so they said in the charter, it's officially Anglican in the Carolinas, but the proprietors should have the discretion to allow non-Anglicans in so they could be exposed to the true Anglican faith, blah, blah, blah. That was the loophole. And so into the Carolinas came French Protestant Huguenots and Quakers and all the different ones, the Salzburgers from, Salzburg, Austria, and all these different Protestant groups are coming in. And it's great until they get a new governor that wants to tighten the screws and make it more Anglican. And by this time, there were so many non-Anglicans in the Carolinas that a group led by a Quaker said, you know what, we don't want to be more Anglican, we're going to split away. And they split away in 1711 and start South Carolina. Do you know I read through every state constitution? 9 of the original state constitutions required you to be a Protestant to hold state office. This is South Carolina's 1778 Constitution. The Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of this state. I've actually talked to attorneys that said, well, if they wanted America to be a Christian nation, why didn't they just put it in the Constitution? It's like, duh, they did. Hello, the Christian Protestant religion shall be deemed the established religion of the state. I think they wanted it to be Christian. And Delaware's Constitution was a little liberal. It said every office holder had to subscribe, I profess faith in God the Father and Jesus Christ, his only Son, the Holy Ghost, one God, blessed forevermore. Why is that liberal? Because you could be any denomination of Protestant and even Catholic and believe that and hold office. Here's a 1774 New Hampshire. No person shall be capable of being elected who's not of the Protestant religion. That was in effect up until 1877. Well, I thought separation of church and state. That was to keep the federal government out of state business. Maryland's 1851 Constitution. No other test is required than an oath to the state, a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. But they added in 1851, and if the party shall profess to be a Jew, the declaration shall be of his belief in a future state of rewards and punishments. And so we look at New England. New England had pastors and churches starting communities. So Reverend John Cotton and his church started Boston. Reverend John Lothrop and his church founded Barnstable, Massachusetts. Reverend Roger Williams and his church founded Providence, Rhode Island. Reverend Thomas Hooker and his church founded Hartford, Connecticut. Reverend John Wheelwright and his church founded Exeter, New Hampshire. So in New England, instead of it being separation of church and state, it was the church that created the state. Hello? These were pastors and their congregations saying, we don't like these Puritans in Massachusetts, they're too strict. And in the Bible, we see a little more freedom of conscience. And tell you what, everybody in my church, get your wagons together. We're going to go hill and dale, make peace with some Indians, chop down some trees. We're going to build a community. And they all go, they build a community, and then they go to the pastor and they say, well, this is really great, but how do we do the government thing? And so the pastors would dig in the scriptures and they would come up. And so here's Calvin Coolidge. He says the principles which went into the Declaration of Independence are found in the sermons of the early colonial clergy. They preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man. In order that they might have freedom to express these thoughts and opportunities to put them into action, whole congregations with their pastors migrated to the colonies. Now the pastors dug in the scriptures and they found two different views. One was the Calvinist Puritan view that God has a plan for your life, your marriage, your family, your church, and your government. Dig in the scripture, find out what his plan is, and put it into place. Another was the Pietist view. Now remember Martin Luther started the Reformation? He had a personal revelation, the just shall live by faith, very personal to him. But some princes wanted to break away from Rome, and they said, guess what, kingdom of mine, you're all Lutheran, if you don't like it, leave. And so the people said, oh, okay, well, we're Lutheran. What do we believe again? And so for the people in those kingdoms, it was not necessarily a personal revelation. And so a movement started called Pietism that said, look, if you really become a Christian, your life should change. And you should not get involved in worldly things like going to bars and brothels and being involved in worldly things like government. Remember Rafael Cruz was saying, oh, with government's too worldly, don't get involved in it. This was the beginning of separation of church and state, right? And so you had two different pastors. One was preaching, God's got a plan, put it in place. And there's like, oh, it's worldly, don't get involved in that. And this is best illustrated, again, as Raphael pointed out, by two brothers, John Peter Muhlenberg and his brother, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg. They're Lutheran pastors in Virginia. Get this, John Peter had to be licensed as an Anglican minister in order to pastor a Lutheran congregation, because Virginia was an Anglican colony. Anyway, so John Peter hears Patrick Henry give me liberty, death, give me the death speech, and goes to Washington, says, I want to help. Washington says, fine, you're a colonel, go get your men. He goes to his church, preaches a sermon, and then the men come forward, they join, they become the 8th Virginia Regiment, they fight in all these battles. After the Revolution, he gets elected to Congress as a congressman. And what happens in that first session of Congress? They pass the First Amendment. Well, his brother, Frederick Muhlenberg, is a Pietist Lutheran pastor in New York. He's writing letters to John Peter saying, you have become too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do. Right? Separation of churches. You're not supposed to talk about politics. John Peter writes back to Frederick and accuses him of being a Tory sympathizer. Frederick writes back and said he could not serve two masters. And then New York City is bombarded, and Frederick Muhlenberg's church is destroyed, and his wife and children have to flee the city. And then he decides, maybe we do need to get involved. And he ends up becoming a congressman, and he becomes the first Speaker of the House. And what happens in that first session of Congress? They pass the First Amendment. So here you have these two brothers that are pastors. They pass a First Amendment. Does anybody honestly think that these two pastors would vote to outlaw themselves? Would they want to pass an amendment that says people of faith should not be involved in government when we were people of faith and we did get involved in government and now we are in charge and one of them is the Speaker of the House? No, the First Amendment was to keep the federal government's hands tied so they wouldn't get involved in telling the churches and the states what to do. Now in New England, the experiment was this. The pastors realized that the kingdom of God could never be forced from the top down. They came from Europe, and in Europe, these kings were forcing people to believe. And they're like, look, we don't see where Jesus forced anybody to believe in him. It's not like Sharia law Islam, where Muhammad said, whoever changes his Islamic faith, kill him. Jesus said something difficult. Many disciples walked with him no more, and Jesus was willing to let them go. And so we see that the God of the New Testament is really into this thing called free will. Put the tree in the garden, says Adam and Eve, don't eat from it, but it is your choice. Gives Moses the law, here's the blessings and the cursings, please choose life, but it's your choice. And so they said, look, if the kingdom of God cannot be forced from the top down, how's it going to happen? They thought if the majority of the people held godly values and voted for representatives that held those values, then laws could be passed reflecting those godly values, and the kingdom's principles could come from the bottom up, not forced from the top down. So this is the experiment that happened. Does power flow from the creator to the king and he dispenses it to the people, or does it flow from the creator to the people and they choose their leaders from amongst themselves? This was the model that the pastors had. Now, where did they get this idea? Well, they got some ideas from England and the Constitution, Rome and the Republic, and Athens with a democracy, but ultimately Israel. And when New Hampshire was voting on whether or not to ratify the U.S. Constitution, Harvard President Samuel Langdon gave an address to the Republic of the Israelites, an example to the American states. Lo and behold, Israel is the first nation that we have record of that ruled itself without a king. Remember they came out of Egypt, and those first 400 years, no king? Everyone was ruled by the law, and the law said there is no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone's treated the same. Male, female, made in the image of the Creator. Lo and behold, Israel is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. That everyone you see is equal to you. There's no royal family to butter up next to. There's no caste system like in India that you were born into. And so everyone in Israel was equal. Israel was the first nation where they had private land ownership. They call it the promised what? Promised land. The land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it, every 50 years it reverted back. This prevented a dictator from gradually accumulating all the land and putting the people back into slavery. Israel had no police because everyone was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. Israel had no standing army because every man was in the militia and ready at a moment's notice to defend his community. Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system where when you harvested your field, you left the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. This way, the poor were taken care of without some government bureaucrat collecting all the money and doling it back out to those who can help them get reelected. Israel had a system of honesty that was a basis for commerce, where it says God hates unjust weights and measures. And then Israel got to choose its own leaders. As Raphael pointed out, Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses spake unto the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your cumbrance? Take you, wise men, understanding and known among your tribes, and I'll make them rulers over you. So look, you know the people in your tribe, you pick them, right? And so Israel was very decentralized, and it looked confusing from the outside, but it had maximum freedom on the inside, and anybody could be raised up in leadership. Gideon, here's Deborah, a woman that becomes a leader in Israel simply because she knows the law and she's honest, and people make their way all across the country to hear her decide the case. Where else in the world could a woman do that without having been related to a pharaoh? So in Israel, they were also the first nation that could read. And in Mesopotamia, where cuneiform was invented, remember that? They had 1,500 cuneiform characters. Have you ever tried to memorize 1,500 anythings? But it was only the kings and the scribes that could read them. In Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters, and it was only the pharaohs and the scribes could read them. The scribes actually kept them complicated on purpose as job security. They were needed. Oh, what does that hieroglyph say? I don't know. Let's get the scribe. And China had 10,000, and it was just for court records for the emperors and their scribes. Well, it was sort of like Virginia and Maryland prior to the Civil War. They had laws making it a crime to teach slaves to read. Frederick Douglass, the Republican advisor to Lincoln, writes about being a little boy on a plantation. The slave master's sister-in-law was teaching him the alphabet. The slave master walks in and yells at her and says, "Don't you dare teach slaves to read. They'll grow discontent and want to run away." In other words, if you want to put a people down, you want them to be uneducated because then you can control them better. And so when Moses came down the mountain, he didn't have the law in 1,500 characters or 3,000 hieroglyphics. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet that was so easy to learn, the entire nation became literate. Israel is the first instance in history of an entire nation that could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read. And as long as the priest taught the law, it worked. And it was this picture of one side of the spectrum is a king. So everybody hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power. Concentrated power. Open fingers in the other say separated power. Separated power. Then back to the fist, concentrated power. That is world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings, pharaohs, Caesar, Kaiser, sultans, and czars. Starting with Israel was this first experiment of people ruling themselves without a king, but in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. But let's see, without a king, that would be chaos. There's no government unless the people have internal morals. But why obey these internal morals? Israel had the most important ingredient, a God who is watching everybody, wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable. So you're about to steal something, and you know you can get away with it, and then you think, wait a second, God's watching. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate. And it creates this thing in your head called a conscience. If everybody in the country believes God is watching, he wants you to be fair, he's going to hold you, everybody self-modifies their behavior. Now, it only works with the God of the Bible. An Islamic God is watching, but he says it's okay to rape the infidel woman. He says it's okay to steal from the infidels. It's the God of the Bible that says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, if you get rid of this God, and then you just got these rules, well, why obey the rules? Some will out of habit, but others are going to say, well, why obey these things? And they're going to give in to their passions and lust, steal, rob, smash windows, get mobs in the street, set buildings on fire. And then the people are going to say, it's chaos. Government, please step in and restore order. Please have your militarized police and your armored personnel carriers come, and they'll take guns away from everybody. And yeah, they'll restore order, but when the dust settles, you'll have just given up ruling yourself, and you'll be back to a king. And so we begin to see that Israel's system worked as long as the priest taught the law. When the priest stopped teaching the law, every man did what was right in their own eyes. It turns into chaos, and they end up getting King Saul. And Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they did not reject you, they rejected me. God's perfect plan for Israel was to not have a king, have every person individually accountable to God, and to have everybody own private property and be blessed, and the priest teaching them the system. Well, then King Saul turns on and kills most of the priests. So here's Chief Justice John Jay. Americans are the first people whom heaven has favored with an opportunity of choosing the forms of government under which they should live. All other constitutions have derived their existence from violence or accidental circumstances. So our founders took the concentrated power of the king, separated it into three branches, separated it federal to state level, and then tied up this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. All the Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent the rubber band from snapping back into the hands of a king. Now, Italy. There was a guy named Machiavelli, lived 500 years ago, and it was a bunch of city-states, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence. They always fought, and Machiavelli thought, you know what, if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling Italy will stop this infighting, and so any means necessary to get there is justified. So if a prince comes in and takes over, they would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows and burn barns and create crisis, the people would cry out for help. The prince would come in, kill the very criminals he bribed to commit the crimes. Nobody would know the better for it. They'd praise the prince as a hero. And so it's this idea of creating or capitalizing on a crisis to consolidate controls, to move away from the people ruling themselves back to a king. This inspired somebody named Hegel. When Napoleon conquered Germany so quick, the king Frederick said, we're not going to let that happen again. We need to strengthen the state. So Hegel said the state is God walking on earth. He comes up with Hegelian dialectics. It's a triangle. One corner is the thesis. The opposite is the antithesis, antithesis. Top is the synthesis. Sounds complicated, but it's not. In other words, you start at the first corner, then you create a problem that's real bad. And everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And you do this over and over again until the people gradually give up their freedoms. And so Karl Marx says, how do you create the antithesis? You send in agitators, organizers, agent provocateurs. Their goal is to create a really bad crisis. Business owners organize the poor against the rich, blacks against whites, Catholics against the Protestants, even the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo. They really don't care who the two sides are. Their goal is to create the destabilizing crises that causes everybody to surrender their freedoms, to have order restored, but in the process, they're going to give up ruling themselves and they'll go back to a king. And so that inspired somebody in Chicago named Saul Alinsky, who rode around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti, and saw how all you had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would give up their rights and freedoms and pay the mob off with extortion money. And so he applied this to politics. Saul Alinsky says the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. So this is something that wants there to be racism, wants there to be riots. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. This is the politics being played out on America. And so we see Occupy Wall Street, Ferguson riots, Baltimore riots, Mizzou protests, Paris attacks, San Bernardino killings, crisis after crisis after crisis. And what I feel like is we're being set up for an Arab Spring. That all these Syrian refugees being brought in and there's no background checks, so there's a good chance there's ISIS members amongst them, and we're going to see these crises build up to a head prior to the next election, and the thought would be the people would say, well, the president needs to declare this a national emergency, and once he does, all the executive orders going back to Kennedy's Bay of Pigs kick in. And the president gets immediate control over the radio, TV, internet, food supplies, highways, waterways, can move whole population groups, controls every financial transaction. And so we're talking about, one is, it's just politics as usual. No, we're talking world power. We're talking the 6,000-year quest for world power, and it's right there within the grasp. And, sort of on the side, I say, if people can justify killing a baby in the womb, tell me, what is it that they can't justify? Anyway, so power concentrates, and so the question is, who is the king in America? And signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Moore, said the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. Chief Justice John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. They've not parted with it. James Wilson, in a free country, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Thomas Jefferson, but the Chief Justice says there must be an ultimate arbiter somewhere. True, there must. The ultimate arbiter is the people. James Madison, the ultimate authority resides in the people alone. Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters, both of Congresses and courts. Andrew Jackson, the people are the government, the sovereign power. Polk, the people are the only sovereigns recognized by the Constitution. Ford, never forget that in America our sovereign is the citizen. The state is a servant of the individual. It must never become an anonymous monstrosity that masters everyone. Omar Bradley, in the United States, it is the people who are sovereign. The government is theirs to speak their voice and voice their will. And then Reagan. And so if the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? In 379 AD, there was a king named Theodosius. He was the Roman emperor. He was Christian. He was going to church in Milan, Italy, and they had a pastor named St. Ambrose. Could you imagine being Bishop Ambrose and having the Roman emperor in your church on Sunday? Guess what? You do. In America, the people are the king. Here's the pewforum.org. A survey. In 2007, 78% of Americans identified themselves as Christian. It's gone down. 2014, it says 70% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. But 70% is still a majority. These are people that say, we're Christian. Guess what? They are going to church somewhere. And so the pastors are counselors to the king. And so, ever see the movie The Lord of the Rings? And there's this scene of a King Theoden, and he has a spell cast on him, and his eyes are gray, his hair is gray, he's like out of it. And he has two counselors. One is named Wormtongue, and he says, stay asleep, separation of church and state. Yes, you're the king, but don't get involved. Just let it be. Soon it'll all be over. And then there's another counselor to the king, Gandalf, and he comes in there and casts the devil out of the guy and says, wake up. And so right before your eyes, the king sort of comes to. And he says, dark have been my dreams of late. Yeah, you've been out of it. And Gandalf says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword, right? The sword of the Spirit. And And so the pastor's job is to wake up the king. So you have one counselor that says, yes, you're the king, but just stay asleep. And another one comes in on Sunday morning and throws a bucket of ice water on his congregation and says, wake up. You don't just have the privilege of voting in America. You will be held accountable to God for what happens in America. Right. You are the king. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. The second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. If you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you are going to be involved in preserving the freedom to preach the gospel. If Sharia law Islam takes over, it's the death penalty for you to tell somebody the gospel. Look at Saudi Arabia. If North Korean communism takes over, you're locked in a labor camp the rest of your life if you tell somebody the gospel. And if the gay homosexual agenda has their way, they're going to censor your sermons and tell you what you can say about the gospel. If you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you will be involved to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. Now, someday you're going to be dead. Just thought I'd end the message with that, a little upper, but you're going to be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died for your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. Imagine you've been there 10,000 years. Maybe you get a chance to meet Moses, right? My father's house are many mansions. I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn out. Get at the burning bush and the wilderness didn't burn up and the logs, anyway. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I say, I was thinking about something else. But imagine being there, and Moses, maybe he's got a big living room like today, right? And maybe Moses is sitting at your table. And after the small talk's over, you say, Moses, tell us the story again. I read the book and I saw the movie, but here you are in person. And Moses will stand up and say, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us. He had these razor-sharp swords, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there with my staff, and I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the table and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. And David will say, well, I was just a teenager, and this thug, Goliath, was mocking our God and making fun of our faith, and these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything about it. And I said, well, enough of them. I took my little sling, hit him in the head, and took his own sword and chopped his head off. And we're going to say, wow. And then Gideon's going to tell his story, and one by one, then they're going to go around the table, and they're going to look at you. Say, we haven't heard your story yet. What did you do when it was your turn to be on earth? What were they saying about God in your country? What were they saying about the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb? Or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? The man shall leave the father, mother, and cleave to his wife. What did you do when it looked like the whole world was against you? They're going to be on the edge of their seat just looking. What are you going to say? I'd hate for Jesus to walk in and have a big screen and all kinds of great things happening and people coming to the Lord and him saying, this is what you could have done if you'd have been just a little more sold out to me. And realize you can't go back to earth to do anything because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died for your sins. Well, guess what? We still can do those things that we'll be known for forever. This is your hour, pastors. God bless you.